So the first 2 episodes of WandaVision have premiered. We just finished watching them. We've got a few thoughts, not too much because there's still a lot we don't know, but here we go. So one of the things I always look for when I'm watching an MCU movie, this goes all the way back to Iron Man. In the credits of the movie, aside from the post-credit scenes, which kind of everybody looks at, but in the credits section, they typically have a section, it's like a special thanks section, and it lists comic book creators, the writers and the artists that worked on the comics that influenced the stories. In this section, we saw both Brian Michael Bendis and David Finch get call-outs. Both of them are the creators of the Avengers Disassembled storyline, where Scarlet Witch first had her big breakdown. That breakdown led to House of M. We talked about this all in the last episode. Oliver Copiel was the artist on House of M. He's also credited in this section here, so it does look like these 2 books have influenced the show, at least to some extent. Tom King got a shout out as well in the credits for his work, presumably on the Vision miniseries from a few years back. So they are pulling from the comics, but again, they're taking very loose ideas. Scarlet Witch altering reality in the House of M storyline could just be Scarlet Witch altering the reality in this world that she's created, this little bubble. In the show, we don't really see too much of the neighborhood they're in. We see just a couple little spots. Predominantly, everything's in black and white. When they do show color, it's typically red. They saw a red blinking light in a kind of a mock commercial from Stark Enterprises. We also saw a character cut themselves and had blood. A toy helicopter was in a bush that was red. The red, obviously, Scarlet Witch, color red. It seems to be somehow tied to Wanda. She's the only character really interacting with the red that we see on screen. I do still think this is kind of Wanda creating this and running the show. Between the first two episodes, not only does she rewind time at one point, she turns the color on in the world. She definitely seems to be not fully in control of it, but can make decisions to affect the world around her directly. And it seems like when she wants to take control, she takes control. The rest of the time, if she's necessarily not in control, it seems like she's a bit confused like the other characters are. They don't really seem to know much about themselves, much about their life prior to this, where they've come from, how long they've been here, but they do reference their history. They mention Sokovia, Wanda's country of origin. They talk about her history there a bit. So we do see hints of the past being brought up in the show, but the characters themselves don't really seem to be aware of fully who they are and how they got here and what led them to this place. Based on what we've seen, S.W.O.R.D's very involved in what's going on. It's a little unusual. Joss Whedon and John Cassaday were both mentioned in the credits. Joss Whedon and John Cassaday created S.W.O.R.D. in the Astonishing X-Men comic book. This is a higher level than S.H.I.E.L.D. S.H.I.E.L.D. takes care of planetary threats. It's a peacekeeping organization in the comics, very similar to the MCU, where they're kind of in charge of world security. S.W.O.R.D. is a level above that. S.W.O.R.D. is supposed to be protecting Earth from interplanetary threats. We did see at the end of the first episode, it appears that somebody at S.W.O.R.D. is monitoring Wanda and Vision inside this like pocket reality she's created. The beekeeper we saw from a lot of the trailers had the S.W.O.R.D. logo on the back of his uniform. So they're leaning very heavily into S.W.O.R.D. One thing to keep in mind with the MCU, there's very rarely a direct line from the comics to the movies. They do tweak with things quite a bit. So I would anticipate S.W.O.R.D. being more of a filler in for S.H.I.E.L.D. since the MCU got rid of S.H.I.E.L.D. During the events of Captain America Winter Soldier. And I think the last big thing we've seen in the show is this whole town seems to be obsessed with children. Every character's asking Wanda and Vision when they're going to have kids. They do this talent show. There's no kids present, but they keep chanting for the children. And there's no children in the show. We don't see any kids in the show. I think there's clearly something going on here with a focus on children, whether that's S.W.O.R.D. trying to get Wanda to create children, or Wanda desperately wants children, and this is her kind of manipulating everything around her. We don't really know yet. So by the end of episode 2, we see Wanda pregnant. In the comics, she gets pregnant with twins. Those twins become Wiccan and Speed, who when they grow up later become members of the Young Avengers down the line. Scarlet Witch and Vision are way less popular characters, so there's way less character development with both of those characters. Because nobody's really made a very strong case for how these characters behave in the comics, they're very malleable. Every writer that comes along kind of puts their own thoughts and feelings into how these characters should behave. So it's kind of nice to see them in the show getting a little bit more room to breathe. They're not bogged down with the 30 other characters that we typically see in the Avengers movies. So I always tended to like lesser known characters, but Scarlet Witch and Vision particularly I liked, both because of their origins. Scarlet Witch was raised by gypsies, fled her home country, then brought in, raised by her father, Magneto, who she didn't know was her father, and he raised her as a terrorist, and she fought the X-Men, and then they reformed, and her brother became Avengers, and they had this whole sordid history. Then the Vision comes along, this like artificial being created to destroy the Avengers, but then he turns on them, and then the two of them kind of falling in love and trying to build a family, and what it's like for a former runaway terrorist mutant witch and a former homicidal killing machine, artificial intelligent robot to both kind of get past their parent programming, build lives for themselves, and build lives for themselves together. They've always, I thought, been really compelling characters, some of Marvel's most interesting, some of Marvel's most powerful characters. This is one of the things I really like about Marvel. With the MCU particularly, they, from the beginning, their first movie wasn't Spider-Man, it wasn't the X-Men, they didn't have the rights to those characters, so they were left with the characters they had. These were characters that no other studio wanted. They couldn't sell Iron Man to other studios, they couldn't sell Thor or Captain America to these other studios. Nobody was interested in those characters because they were B-list characters. So Marvel has a long history of taking characters like Iron Man. Nobody cared about Iron Man 10 years ago when they started these movies. Iron Man was like a B-list character. A lot of people didn't even know Iron Man. Now he's a household name. They did this with the Guardians of the Galaxy. Nobody knew who the Guardians of the Galaxy were before that movie came out. They didn't even use the original Guardians of the Galaxy. They used an updated team from the early 2000s. So Marvel has a habit of banking on their lesser known properties and knowing that with the right touch, with the right creator, those characters can sing. And that's, I think, what they're doing with WandaVision. It wasn't supposed to be the first Disney Plus show. COVID-19 kind of threw a wrench in their timeline. I think we were supposed to get Falcon and Winter Soldier first, which kind of would have made sense. That was the big thing we saw at the end of Endgame, was Falcon being handed the shield from Captain America, and that seemed like the next logical show to start. But due to COVID, they moved some stuff around with the scheduling. These shows probably don't have a lot of crossover between them. So I think that's why we got WandaVision first. But in terms of why they went with WandaVision, to me, that just seems like the natural next step to go. Iron Man wasn't a household name before this, neither were Wanda and Vision, and hopefully afterwards they will be. So if you like this content, want to see more, feel free to subscribe to the channel. It's probably the only way you'll ever see another episode. I'm terrible at sharing this kind of stuff on social media. If you do want to follow me on social media, you can find me on Instagram at @theBraveButterPecan. And if you want to hear me talk more about this kind of stuff, I do a weekly episode, I do a weekly podcast every week called Caffeinated Comics. Our episode this week will specifically be talking about WandaVision. We release a new episode every Monday.